Hi everybody, and welcome to the second edition of our study of migration stories in the book of Genesis. We will have a discussion Wednesday, and we'll be following these stories. You can see that this week we're looking at a story that begins with reference to a famine, and that's going to be an important dynamic here for us. If you have any questions about the content, the process, anything to do with our study, please feel free to contact us. The office here at St. Mark is closed this week on Monday and Tuesday because of the holiday, and so you can contact us starting Wednesday morning. All right, remember last week I mentioned that in Deuteronomy 26, whenever the people of Israel were settled in their land and began to raise crops, one of their practices was to bring the first fruits of their harvest to a temple or synagogue, or there weren't synagogues at this time, a temple or some kind of holy place, and give it to the priest. The priest would set it on the altar, and then they were to recite who they were, a profession of faith that began with the phrase, "My father was a wandering Aramean." And that's Abram. That's what we're looking at now, are these wanderings. And just to refresh our memory from what we've already read in chapter 12, verses 1 through 9, we can see that Abram, when he was called by God, was in Haran. He was sent to a place that he didn't know exactly where his destination was. He went south, came to Canaan, stopped at Shechem. God told him there, "This is the land that I will give to you and your descendants." So you would think Abram said, "Cool," and start digging the foundations for a house or something like that. Abram builds an altar and then continues moving south. He ends up in a place between Bethel, which means house of God, Bethel, and Ai. And there he builds another altar, and there he does something very significant. It just says Abram began to call on the name of the Lord. And that's kind of the beginning of religion. Religion is the human response to God's doings. Of many things. That's really what religion as a phenomenon is. It's the human response to what God or the gods, depending on the religion, are doing in the world. And now we're starting to see, build altars, call on the name of the Lord. These are important things that will continue to be important throughout the Old Testament. But even then, after calling on the name of the Lord, building the second altar, Abram's not done, right? He continues to journey, and he heads toward the Negev, which we'll visit some other time. All right, so he truly is a wandering Aramean. He's moving along, and what's interesting is the word wandering. It's well selected. Almost every translation goes with the word wandering here. The primary meaning of that word is actually perishing. It's often referring to a sheep that gets lost from the fold and perhaps is dying or in danger, something like that. Sometimes it simply refers to perishing, period. So to be a wandering Aramean, it doesn't just simply mean he has wanderlust. It means that his life is almost continually in peril. That's the ancestor our worship experience teaches us to embrace, okay? So this week we're reading verses 10 through 20, and it starts with a very significant verse 10. I'm going to spend more time on this verse than all the rest because I think it's more significant for our study. And it reads, "Now there was a famine in the land. So Abram went down to Egypt to reside there as an alien, for the famine was severe in the land." So you can see that the verse begins and ends with reference to famine, and just in case you don't realize the implications of that, it's repeated, right? Yeah, there was severe famine. So this is not like God's call that said, "Hey, just start heading south. I'll tell you when you get there." This is a migration story driven by famine. That is very, very similar to many migration stories. and even similar to other migration stories in the book of Genesis. Because we know that later in the book of Genesis, Jacob's 12 sons, and eventually Jacob, or Israel, his name is changed to himself, they all end up being driven by famine to live in Egypt. So this is a significant beginning of this story, and it's a phenomenon that gets echoed in other stories. In story time, Egypt is just another neighboring, perhaps budding empire or something. So we've been up in Mesopotamia, we've been in the land of Canaan, and now we're going into Egypt. In story time, it's just another country, but a welcoming country during a time of famine, because Egypt is a little better prepared for that and doesn't seem to be suffering the effects the way that Canaan is. And but in written time, by the time this story was written, Egypt looms large in their mind. This is the place where we went and we were welcomed, but then we stayed, and then we were unwelcomed, then we were enslaved, and then you have the whole story of the Exodus, where God, with a mighty hand, had to redeem us from slavery in Egypt and bring us back to the Promised Land. That's on your mind when you see Egypt as a reader of this story, because you're well on this side of the Exodus story. And there are other things in the story that we'll see that are related to the whole incident of being in Egypt as slaves and ultimately rescued. So it would be almost like hearing a story from earlier in the life of the United States, but something happens in Russia or Iran, and you can't get out of your head the more modern meanings of what the state of Russia means to the U.S. or what Iran has meant since 9/11 and so forth. So the readers of this story hear the word Egypt, and we should not imagine that it doesn't ring a bell, right? It means something, and particularly living in Egypt as an alien. What an interesting phrase here. This whole phrase is a translation of this one Hebrew word, ger. And it's interesting. Ger can mean to travel, to sojourn, but it typically has the connotations of living abroad in a place that's not your own, as an alien or a stranger or something like that. So it's interesting how this word gets translated in this verse. The ESV, the English Standard Version, simply says, Abram went to Egypt to sojourn there. Sojourn is a word that a lot of Christian groups like, maybe because of the great magazine Sojourners. But I don't think sojourn quite picks up on the dynamics of power that are present when one resides in another place as someone who doesn't necessarily belong there or doesn't feel like they belong there. The New International Version, I think, milquetoasts this, as well as the New American Standard Bible. New International Version says he went to live there for a while. The New American Standard said he went to live there for a time. It's almost, I don't know. It almost makes it sound like Abram on a study abroad year from school or something. You know, he just chooses to go down to Egypt, and you kind of miss the point. He's driven by famine, and when he gets there, he's got no rights. This word ger means something more than just, willy-nilly traveling abroad. So I think the New Revised Standard Version actually has it best. It could be better, perhaps, but it has it better than the others. That Abram went to live there as an alien, to reside there as an alien. Not just passing through. He not a nomad. There's no sense that he lives a nomadic life. He lives there as an alien. Just think about the power dynamic going there. And then again, the reiteration, for the famine was severe in the land. So you live there as someone who's coming to be helped. That's a vulnerable position. Okay, that's verse 10. And I won't spend quite so much time on each verse. But look what happens in verses 11 through 13. When he was about to enter Egypt, Abram said to his wife Sarah, I know well that you are a beautiful woman, a woman beautiful in appearance. And when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, but they will let you live. Say you are my sister, so that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared on your account. In his commentary on Genesis, Sip Towner says there's just nothing good about Abram in this story. I mean, he's both unfaithful religiously and kind of a schmuck personally, right, in doing this. So as they're about to enter into Egypt, the reason he's not just sojourning or living there for a while is he understands that he doesn't have the rights, he doesn't have the name, he doesn't have the reputation, he doesn't have the confidence in Egypt that he might have had in Haran and perhaps even in Canaan. He's going into Egypt and he worries. He worries. So there are two big theological issues that are in play here, and they are going to continue throughout the book of Genesis. And that is, first of all, God has made an audacious promise to Abram. A 75-year-old man, he and his wife have a barren marriage, and God has said to them, I will make you the beginnings of a great nation. So one theological question is, can God do this? Will God do this? Is this going to happen, really? Can we depend on God to be true to God's word? That's one part of it. The other part is connected. It's not quite the same thing, but they're kind of inseparable, is will Abraham, Sarah, and their descendants be faithful and trust in God to fulfill that promise? And verse 4 of this chapter would say, yeah, Abram's faithful. I mean, God says, listen, tear yourself up from everything you know and love and go to a place that I show you. And I'll make you a great nation. And verse 4, powerful, says, Abram went as God told him. And it would seem in verse 4 anyway that Abram completely trusts God to make this great nation happen, regardless of whatever securities he has to give up. But now, going into Egypt, now something's different. And he's feeling the anxiety. And he concocts a lie. And this is the schmucky part, right? This is where he tells Sarah to present herself as his sister. As his sister. In this story, that's a lie. We can talk about later stories where it maybe is not so much a lie. But in this story, it's a lie. It's a lie, pure and simple. So the question of whether God is faithful, we don't know yet. But Abram is not trusting that God is going to be able to take care of him. So he's depending on his own deceit. That's not an uncommon thing that we see in the book of Genesis. And I want to struggle with you with that some on Wednesday. And so Abram says, you know, if you're my wife, they'll kill me, they'll take you. So say that you're my sister so that things will go well for me on your account. It's not going to play out well here. And this seemed horribly selfish, not just unfaithful. That's all we can say. So Abram's now scheming because he doesn't seem to be trusting in God. Not nearly the way he was back in verse 4. This story gets retold. We looked at this a couple weeks ago, last week perhaps. This story gets retold in Genesis chapter 20 and in Genesis chapter 26. In Genesis 20, again, it's Abraham and Sarah. They're in a different country, and a king named Abimelech in that story takes Sarah into his house. And when Abimelech confronts Abraham in that story, he says, well, she really is my sister. We have the same father, different mother. Think what you want about that. My sense is some storyteller is trying to present Abraham as not simply a bald-faced liar. In this story, Abraham is mute, doesn't say anything, and we don't have that excuse to fall back on. But here he is. He's scheming. Sarah will pay the price. Abraham's life will be spared. The story gets retold in Genesis 26, with Isaac and his wife, Rebekah. Walter Brueggemann says, try as we might. I mean, this is a biblical commentator's dream, right? To have a story told three different ways. You can do all kinds of comparisons and contrasts. And Walter Brueggemann says, it just doesn't help anything to compare and contrast them. It doesn't bring any insight. There's nothing redeemable about this story. And that's a pretty interesting thing for a commentator to say. All right, so that's what's happening in verses 11 through 13. Abram scheming with Sarah for her to be presented as his sister so that he may not be killed. Let's see what happens from there, and we'll read verses 14 through 17. When Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. When the officials of Pharaoh saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. And for her sake, he dealt well with Abram, and he had sheep and oxen, male donkeys, male and female slaves, female donkeys, and camels. Oh, and let me read verse 17. But the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarah, Abram's wife. Okay, so verses 14 through 16 is the drama here, that Abram's intuition was actually correct. Sarah is so stunningly beautiful that the Egyptians want her for themselves and not him. And she's so beautiful that some Egyptians even tell Pharaoh about her. Now, this is a different Pharaoh than we see in the book of Exodus. It's a different Pharaoh than we see at the end of the book of Genesis. Pharaoh is a title, not a name. So this is kind of like Caesar. You got to know which Pharaoh, which Caesar you're talking about when you're going on and on about it. So they bring her into Pharaoh's house. We tend to think of this story as being kind of a quick affair, just kind of happening like that. And there are reasons not to think that. So if you ever wonder what it's like to be taken into Pharaoh's palace, or at least to be taken into the palace of the leader of an other nation's empire, you might want to read the first couple of chapters of Esther and see what her experience was. Sarah is basically being entered into Pharaoh's harem, as it were. I don't know ancient Egyptian practices, but if Abraham and Sarah go to Egypt because of a famine, a severe famine, and at the end of the story they leave Egypt and head back up to Canaan, famines don't just take place over a matter of days or even weeks, right? A severe famine means that an entire crop season is lost or more. So the way this story is told doesn't invite us to think that she's only there for a night. This could have been a real harrowing episode of a significant chunk of time of Sarah's life. There's a lot in that phrase, she was taking into his palace. And Abram was paid very richly because as her brother, she's a bit of chattel slavery to him. And he can sell her more or less. It's a way of honoring This is the dowry that the brother gets. This is a point at which Abram, who's already got possessions and some people that he obtained up in Haran, still traveling with Lot, now he takes on a lot of more herds and mouths to feed, which means that if there's a severe famine up north, it's going to be even harder to keep this group alive, whether it's animals or herders or whatever. So this is one of those stories where I would say, even though it happens in the process of a few verses, perhaps we want to imagine it in the story as taking place over a long period of time. And whether Sarah was violated in that time or not, we're not told. It would stand to reason if that she was, or at least that they tried. We're going to find out in a minute that something's going on here, because it ends by saying, verse 17, that Pharaoh's house was afflicted with plagues. Now, if you're an Israelite after the Exodus and you're reading a story about Pharaoh's house being afflicted by plagues, you can't not think about those first few chapters of Exodus and the 10 plagues that Moses pronounced and that God brought on the Egyptians as a part of their Exodus journey. This would be echo. It's kind of premeditative language, right? So this is language we'll hear again in Pharaoh's house. But again, you don't just get struck with a plague overnight and then the next morning say, wow, this Sarah chick, she must really be bad news, because all of a sudden we have plagues. Plagues take time. They begin as nuisances, annoyances. They become overwhelming, and it's left completely undefined. We don't know what this means. We don't know if it's flies. We don't know if it's venereal disease. We don't know what it is that is going on here. In the story of Abimelech, it's suddenly nobody can have babies. The whole town. So is that what's going on? That's certainly not something you discover in one night, right? So again, it's an indicator that two things, that this story is something of a parallel story to the one we'll hear later about the Exodus from Egypt. But it also just invites us to see this is a long, drawn-out thing. And not just an overnight nightmare for Sarah, but years, months, years, something like that. I think the story invites us to hold it that way, which in my mind makes Abraham's deceit even more troubling on a personal level. Okay, and then look what happens in verses 18 through 20. So Pharaoh called Abram and said, "What is this that you've done to me? Why did you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister? Or why did you not tell me she is your wife? Why did you say she is my sister, so that I took her for my wife? Now then, here's your wife. Take her and be gone." And Pharaoh gave his men orders concerning Abram, and they set him on his way with his wife and all that he had. So there's a lot here that goes unexplained, right? How did they figure out that the reason they're having plagues is because Sarah is in fact his wife and not his sister? Don't know. We don't know. They don't tell us. Somehow they figure it out. So Pharaoh confronts Abram, and frankly, in this moment, and this is something that's just curious, we'll deal with it perhaps on Wednesday or simply at another time. Pharaoh seems nobler than Abraham in this story. And the same is true for Abimelech in a later story. That's a thing. That's a thing in Genesis. Like, the people of promise are not always the good people in any kind of moral sense in the story. When I read the story of Jacob and Esau, I end up liking Esau better than Jacob. Jacob was also a schemer and not particularly good person, especially to his spouses. So in this part of the story, Pharaoh comes across as, I think, nobler than Abram and confronts him. Abraham is mute. He doesn't say anything. He doesn't say, she's my sister. That's not this story's byline. In this story, he got caught lying. That's what happened. And the story ends with Pharaoh sending Abram away with his things, and he's on the move again, and he's going to go back up to the land of Canaan. If you read further a little bit into the 13th chapter, it says, now Abram was very rich in livestock, silver, and gold. He journeyed by stages from the Negeb as far as Bethel, to the place where he had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place where he had made an altar at first, and there Abraham called on the name of the Lord. So we're circling back up to where we left off last week, which is one reason why Walter Brueggemann argues that this story looks like a later insertion to kind of explain why Abram was so wealthy. Perhaps we don't know exactly why it's inserted, but if you end with verse 9 from last week and then skip over to chapter 13, verse 2, it looks like that's the storyline, and this is kind of an interpolation, something that's put in for reasons that are kind of hard to explain. All right, so we're treating this as a migration story because we're bearing in mind the severity of verse 10, that there was a severe famine in the land. We're treating it as a migration story because we can see that as a migrant, Abram is in Egypt, and he's very dependent on what's going on there. I just want to finish by reading what Walter Brueggemann, how he kind of sums this up, I think very well. He says, Abram has left the well-being of Mesopotamia. He discovers that the promised land is a famine land, and now has to deal with the imperial reality of a ruthless nation that does not have to explain itself to anyone. And he has to do that as a resourceless man who only has a promise. And then it's God, it's the Lord, who comes into this story with the plagues and addresses the imbalance of what we could call imperial power and immigration reality. That's the preaching moment in the story, as it were, and that's what I want you to pay attention to, is because God sends the plague that ultimately frees Sarah from the house of Pharaoh. That's what addresses the imbalance of an alien, a foreigner, an immigrant, a refugee from a famine, dependent on the welcome or the disruption of the empire of Egypt. God has to address that, and God does, and Abraham comes out better. So, like Abraham or not, it is the case that God is faithful to the promise in this story, even though Abram seems to be scheming and relying on his own devices. All right, so that's going to do it for now. There's a lot left on the table to discuss. If you don't like Abraham in this story, join the club. This is not his finest hour. It's not his only hour, but it's not his finest hour. And but boy, what an insight into the power dynamics between those who are residing as an alien in a host country. That's what we'll talk about on Wednesday. Thanks. Bye.